My stepdad said, family doesn't owe family anything. Then I found receipts for my inheritance he spent. I was 21 when my real father died in a construction accident. The funeral was small, just me, my mom, and a handful of dad's coworkers who brought casseroles and stood awkwardly by the refreshment table. Mom had divorced him when I was 7, citing irreconcilable differences that I later understood meant his drinking. But dad got sober 3 years before he died, and we'd rebuilt something fragile but real during those years. Sunday dinners at his apartment, phone calls where he asked about my community college classes, small things that meant everything because we both knew how close we'd come to losing each other entirely. Brad showed up to the funeral in a suit I'd never seen before. He'd been dating my mom for about 8 months at that point, and I didn't hate him exactly, but I didn't love him either. He was just there, filling space in our house with his too loud laugh and his habit of leaving dishes in the sink. He shook hands with dad's coworkers and made appropriate sympathetic noises, but I caught him checking his phone during the service. Mom didn't notice because she was too busy crying into tissues that Brad kept handing her with practiced efficiency. 2 weeks after the funeral, a lawyer named Douglas Kemp called my cell while I was restocking shelves at the grocery store where I worked part-time. He said he'd been trying to reach me about my father's estate and needed to schedule a meeting. I told him I didn't know dad had an estate, that he'd lived in a one-bedroom apartment and drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it. Douglas said we should still meet, and something in his voice made my stomach drop. We set an appointment for the following Thursday at his office downtown. The office smelled like old paper and coffee. Douglas was maybe 60 with reading glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He spread documents across his desk and explained that my father had a life insurance policy through his union. $250,000 with me listed as the sole beneficiary. The words hit me like physical objects I couldn't catch. Dad had been paying into this policy for 19 years, even during the worst of his drinking, even when he could barely afford groceries. Douglas pushed a form across the desk and said I needed to fill out some paperwork, but the money should be deposited within 30 days. I drove home in a daze and found Mom and Brad in the kitchen. They were cooking dinner together, laughing at something on Brad's phone. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them move around each other with easy familiarity, and felt suddenly like an outsider in my own house. When I told them about the insurance policy, Mom's face lit up with genuine happiness. She hugged me and said Dad would be so proud that he'd taken care of me one last time. Brad congratulated me and suggested we go out to celebrate, which felt wrong, but I didn't know how to say no. At dinner, Brad ordered expensive wine and kept toasting to new beginnings. He talked about smart ways to invest money and suggested I meet with his financial advisor. Mom nodded along, saying Brad really knew about these things because he worked in sales. I mostly pushed pasta around my plate and wondered why I felt uneasy instead of grateful. On the drive home, Brad launched into a speech about family helping family and how we should pool our resources now that we were all doing better. I didn't respond because I was trying to figure out what he meant by we. The insurance money hit my account on a Wednesday morning exactly 29 days after my meeting with Douglas. I checked my banking app during my break and stared at the balance until my eyes watered. $250,000. More money than I'd ever imagined having. More money than made sense when I was earning $11 an hour stocking shelves and living in my childhood bedroom. I felt grateful and terrified and completely overwhelmed. That night, Mom sat me down at the kitchen table with Brad beside her. She was wringing her hands the way she did when she was nervous, and Brad kept his expression carefully neutral. Mom said they needed to talk to me about something important. She explained that she and Brad were behind on the mortgage because she'd taken unpaid leave after Dad's funeral. They were 3 months behind and the bank had sent a final notice. Brad jumped in to say they just needed help catching up, maybe $15,000 to get current and avoid foreclosure. He added that family takes care of family and I'd be helping Mom keep the house where I grew up. The number felt huge but also manageable compared to what I had. I said yes before really thinking it through because Mom looked so worried and Brad kept emphasizing that I'd be saving my childhood home. We went to the bank the next morning and I wrote a check for $15,000. Brad insisted on coming inside with us and stood close enough that I could smell his cologne while I signed the forms. The teller counted out the cashier's check and Brad took it from the counter before I could reach for it. He said he'd handle depositing it directly to the mortgage company to make sure everything got processed correctly. 2 weeks later, Brad mentioned that his car had died and he needed to replace it for work. Full story on my channel and linked below.